This is NEGOTIATEx Podcast, show number 114. Hello, welcome to the NEGOTIATEx Podcast. My name's Nolan Martin. Joining me, as always, Aaron Denesian. Aaron, would you like to introduce the guest and what we've got going on today?
Obviously, not only do we have a guest on the podcast, but I have a guest in my home. So this is a little bit of a shift from how we typically do this. So Nolan and audience, it is my honor to introduce award-winning British storyteller Simon Brooks, who has been entrancing audiences for over 20 years. His tales, both live, in person, or virtual, and his award-winning recordings contain everything from humor to pathos, all with a wink and a smile. He invites all to investigate and to become fascinated with story as he drops you into tales so vividly you would think you were somewhere else. Simon's workshops have been attended by educational professionals, business owners, fashion designers, parents, and children. His teaching ranges from storytelling workshops to presentation skills and techniques. Attendees of his workshops are treated to a dynamic experience, whether storyteller or young student, pastor or business person. They are packed with great information you'll take home and immediately use. Simon has performed at hundreds of schools, colleges, libraries, cafes, pubs, and festivals, including the National Storytelling Festival in Jonesboro, Tennessee, teller in residence at the ISC, and the Timpanogos. See, that's why I wanted him here, was to make sure I can pronounce things correctly. Storytelling Festival in Utah, amongst others. He has also shared stories with complete strangers at airports and other odd places. And maybe we'll investigate some of the places. I'll also add that I first met Simon at an event here in New Hampshire. My wife, my children, and I were just mesmerized. We've become semi-groupies, which is part of why he's in our home. But he just lives a town down. So anyways, we've been following him around different events. Stalking. Yes, you can find him at my home or at simonbrookstoryteller.com. Simon, welcome to the home. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. This is great. This is a beautiful view outside the window of the studio here.
Loose term studio. All right, so why don't we start with a story? Can you share one of your favorites and then maybe tell us why it's your favorite story to tell?
Yeah, telling a favorite story is kind of like, what's your favorite drink right now, right? What's your favorite food right now?
What's your favorite child?
Yes, very much so. I will start off with a story to give it some thought about the stories I'm going to tell today. And this story comes from East Africa, and it's about a farmer, and he raises cattle. And the cattle that he raises are those large white cows, the hump on the neck and the big flappy bit down in the huge horns. And he raises these cattle because they're not only good for milk, but they're also good for beef. They're dual use, as it were. And he'd been raising cattle for most of his life. And he was, he's proud of his livestock and he loved his livestock. And one day he went to milk them. Milk was his prime source of income. And he found that the cows were dry. And so he thought, well, maybe it's just the food they're eating here, and maybe I need to move them to somewhere else. So he took them to another place for them to eat, and he went to milk them again, and again, the cows were dry. And so he moved them to a third spot, and he thought, I'm going to sleep out here tonight and see if someone's actually stealing my milk, because it's unusual that 2 days in a row they'd be empty, right? They'd be dry. And so he waited and waited and waited, and he's trying to keep himself awake, and then he hears this sound, and it's like this magical tinkling almost. And the moon is full and bright, and he's looking around, trying to see who's there, but he can't see anyone. And then the sound changes, and he realizes that this sound is women's laughter. They're talking, they're singing. He looks up, something catches his eye, and he looks up, and he sees these maidens, these women coming down on these silver threads. And upon each back of every one of these maidens, there's a basket. And each basket is woven in an absolute unique manner, different colors, different patterns. And as they get closer and closer to the ground, he sees that one hand is carrying a pail, it's carrying a bucket. And as soon as they touch down, they walk over to his cattle. They throw the buckets under the cattle and they begin to start milking. And he's flabbergasted. What are you doing? These are my cows. This is the third time you're milking my cows. You're stealing my milk. And he ran towards them. And the women, shocked, they jump up, grab what they have in their pails, run to these silver threads and grab hold of them. Up into the sky they go, apart from one. When she was startled, her basket fell off of her back, and it just took that little bit more to get going. And when she reached up for her thread, it was already gone. The farmer came up to her and said, what are you doing? Who are you? Where have you come from? And why do you keep stealing my milk? And she said, well, I told my sisters this was the third time. Normally we would only go to one herd at a time. You see, we come from the stars. We come from the heavens. And we have everything that we need except milk. We come down and we take milk, but we never take it from the same person more than once. And I told my sisters that you had moved your cattle. And he looked at her and he said, well, how are you going to get back up home? And she said, I don't know. The thread is gone. And he looked at her and he said, well, would you like to stay with me? And she said, I will stay with you on one condition, and that is you never look in my basket. And he looked at the basket on her back and he's like, that's easy. That's an easy promise. I'll do it. Yeah, sure. And so she goes back to his house. He makes up a pallet for her on which to sleep, and they live together. And she helps him with the cattle and helps him with the milking of the cows and going to market, and everything goes really, really well. And they get on fairly well. You know, they're not enemies by any means. They like each other. And then one day she steps out of the house and she realizes 10 steps on that she doesn't have the basket on her back. This is the first time she's left this home without the basket on her back. And she takes those 10 steps back and she opens the door and she sees the man sitting there on the ground and he's looking in a basket. And when he looks up and sees her, he bursts out laughing. Why did you tell me not to look in the basket? There is nothing in here. Why did you make such a promise if there's nothing in this basket? And he laughed as the woman just sat there staring at him. And she said, I'm going to leave. You made a promise to me that you would never look in the basket. And the other reason is because you did not see what was in it. For within my basket are my dreams, my goals, my aspirations, my talents, and my skills. And she walked over, took the basket from the man, put it on her shoulders, made her way out into the field. And there was a silver thread hanging down. And she took hold of it and was pulled up into the heavens, never to be seen again.
Wow. A round of applause.
For sure.
Why do you like that story so much?
So, well, one of the reasons that I like that story so much is because it's about power and how we can give it and take it, right? And there's a lot of people there that don't have very much power. You know, it's not just women. There are other people out there that don't have power. And I think it's important to show people that, you know, don't forget these people, right? And also there are people out there that have been abused in one form or another.
Yeah.
And I think this story is a safe way of talking about that in some way or another to make it come out and for people to understand that, you know, the little things do make a huge difference, right? And in this particular story, the woman is powerful enough and has enough emotional intelligence to know this is not going to work.
Yeah.
And so she makes the step to return to a previous place.
Well, I mean, I like it. I like the calling them on a commitment. Don't make a commitment
Yes.
if it's not something you can follow through on.
Right.
But also, I liked it because it's about seeing people, right? And seeing what matters to someone,
Right.
and being able to look inside. And if you can't see that, that's probably not someone I want to associate with, right? In any form.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you could, you know, from a business point of view, you could look at it as, you know, she's an employee coming in and the guy is the manager or the, you know, whoever's in charge, right? The supervisor and what have you. And, you know, if respect is a two-way street.
Yeah.
Right. And you have to respect the people that you work for and you have to respect the people that you are employed by. There's a certain level where that needs to be earned as well.
Yeah.
And obviously in this particular case, the guy didn't earn it at all.
Not at all.
And so she was like, no, I'm done. Yeah.
So Simon, what drew you to storytelling in the first place? I mean, was there a moment, experience that made you realize this is definitely something that I want to do?
It's kind of odd. I mean, basically what happened was I've always written stories. Ever since I was a kid, I've written stories. And so, you know, growing up, I'd write stories down and I'd read them a year or two later and I'd be like, this is rubbish, throw it out, right? And, you know, because I didn't think of longevity or anything like that, I'm looking back on that stuff and being like, oh, bless. So I threw a lot of it away, but I always wrote and I kept writing. And, you know, to cut a long story short, I ended up running youth hostels in England and Wales on the south coast. And what I would do is I'd see these school groups that come and stay and these families will come and stay. And the teachers and the parents, they're not used to looking after kids 24/7, right? Unless they're homeschooled, right? But you could see sometimes towards the end of the week, if they were staying for a week, these people would be getting like a little bit antsy. And so I had all these stories. I was like, well, in the hostel that we had, they had this big living room space and all the dormitories were like off that space. And so I'll take the kids in the living room and I'll tell them stories and you can see me straight from the dormitory. Right. And so the parents or the teachers would be drinking a glass of wine. I'd be telling my stories to the kids. And then one day a group of teachers said, we're going to go and see a storyteller in Hastings, actually in Battle, where the Battle of Hastings took place. Okay. Would I like to come along? And so I said, absolutely, I'd love to come along. And so I was taken. This guy, Eric Madden, he told these folk and fairy tales. Well, they were historical stories, but there were some myths and legends in there as well. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is brilliant. Why am I telling my stories when you've got these folk and fairy tales that have so much power to them and they're compacted so nicely, you know? And so I dropped telling my own stories and began to tell folk and fairy tales. And then when I met my wife there running the youth hostels and she didn't want to live in a hostel filled with 60 screaming kids 24/7, right?
Why not?
So I came over to the States, and she's the youngest of 7. There were nephews and nieces that I told stories to. And then another long story short, I ended up being a stay-at-home dad. And some friends of mine said, you should become a children's librarian because you do all this storytelling stuff and you hang out with all these kids and do lots of arts and crafts and other things with them, hiking and whatnot. Like, why don't you take this job? There's this library that needs a children's librarian. I was like, well, I'm not trained. But at the end of the summer, they were still looking for someone. So I got a job there. And I was telling stories, not reading from a book, but actually telling the stories. And the mommy circuit told other libraries that they would go to. And those libraries started to phone me up and say, you're a storyteller, come and tell stories. And I was like, sure, literally how it began. At that time, I'd been a professional photographer. That's what I'd gone to college and studied. And at that time, I was trying to reignite the photography. And I was making exactly the same amount of money doing the storytelling as I was with the photography without the outlay of the expenses of film and processing and all that kind of stuff. And I realized that I needed to put my energy into one or the other. So I went all in with the storytelling, and it's been absolutely brilliant for me. I love it. I talking about like unusual places, if I see children that are upset with families and stuff, it's like, I'll go over and like, hey, I'm a storyteller, can I tell your kids a story? And some people are like, no, go away, strange man. There are other parents that are like, yeah, sure, go for it. And I'll tell the kids a story, and sometimes it settles them down, and sometimes it's a massive failure. But, but it's just opening these people up. This is another thing that you can do to calm a child down or anyone down, really. And so that's the whole story.
And I've seen that in practice. I've seen him with a group, and in different situations, kids come in, maybe not if they're behaving best for whatever reason, and the power of the story to settle them, which really kind of leads to my next question, which is, throughout history, storytelling has been central, whether it's to cultures or societies and certainly to families. Mm-hmm. I'm curious, why do you think that stories hold such enduring power across time and place?
So with folk and fairy tales, myths and legends as well, I think the main thing is that as soon as we started to be able to describe things around us, we wanted to try and understand the things around us. And so these stories do that. Right? Look at the paintings on the walls, the caves in France, right? They're talking about hunting expeditions. And some of those paintings show where to go hunting, where the best, catches and whatnot. But these folk and fairy tales have been passed along orally for like hundreds and hundreds of years, right? They were written down for the first time in the 17 and 1800s, right? Before then, they were always passed on orally. So all of the rough edges are being taken away, right? And so you've got this incredibly powerful story that explains our world around us. It shows us the commonality of our existence, no matter where we come from, and we can share in that experience. And when you share stories, you actually end up building community. I can go into a school or a community where I'm doing stories for the community. And when you drive into a town, you can see from signs the polarity politically of that community.
Sure.
But you can tell these stories, and in telling these stories, that community starts to come together because the stories that you tell share the commonality of each of us, right? And it's like, yeah, maybe I've treated someone like that and I need to be a better boss. Or, oh my God, I'm stuck in that situation. Maybe I need to walk out. Just using that story as an example. Stories like Hansel and Gretel. We don't leave our children anymore out in the wilderness to starve to death, not to starve to death, but to be killed by the animals because it's a quicker way to die than starving, right? Which is slow and painful. Yeah. But children are still abandoned, right? Not in the woods, but the parents that have jobs that take them far away from home, or they're working 2 or 3 jobs just to keep a roof over their head, right? Parents might be incarcerated, or the parents might be just too busy doing their own thing, right, to spend time with that child. And that child feels abandoned, right? And so the child can identify with that.
That's right.
There are dark things out in the woods, whether it's the woods right out here, right? Or if it's the woods in a city, Chicago town, right? There are monsters and evil people out there. And these stories, they give you hope. Even though this is a really terrible place I'm in right now, there's hope that I can get out of this. There are gems to be found somewhere. I just got to look for them and find them.
Yeah.
So many motifs in the stories. There's the helper, right? And it's like in the workplace, you might find someone that's willing to help you get over a certain problem, right? And they help you on to the next stage. Then you become the helper because you learned something and hopefully you give it back, right? So there's that side to all these stories. And I think that's why they endure, is because, they're like distilled wisdom.
Right. They reinforce, whether it's themes that we go through, abandonment or whatever, and they're common themes. And then you mentioned kind of building community, bringing people together. Nolan, I know every military unit I was ever a part of, and I would assume you can probably talk to it as well, particularly like special ops, the power of story, the sharing of, great deeds or brave actions, reinforcing that, whether it's on a small scale or something larger.
Yeah, I think that's also how the legends are born, right? You always hear these crazy stories about, someone did so-and-so, they earned a silver star, and it's just like, man, powerful because this person. It's relatable. Like you see this person. And so, yeah, definitely see the impact, and especially throughout our military career. So what's the secret sauce? Is it the British accent? Is it the content? You named a bunch of things there of how it's so important.
I think the secret sauce is being authentic. The English accent helps me over here, right? But it doesn't help me back in the UK at all. In fact, my accent is, I've been told I can't remember the town that I was in, but I was looking at this Royal Air Force Memorial Garden. And the guy was just locking up and he's like, yeah, there's some of you lot in here too. And I was like, what do you mean you lot? And he's like, Yanks. And I'm like, I'm English. And he's like, well, you sound like a Yank. Right. So I guess I have this mid-Atlantic voice right now.
Okay.
So it doesn't really work in the UK either now. Anyway, but so it's not the voice is what I'm saying. It's the story. When you tell the story, you have to be authentic. And when I'm telling stories from other cultures, like that first one from Africa, I don't want to have people thinking it's a Guernsey. Right, because they don't have Guernseys in Eastern Africa. If they do, I don't know of it.
Yeah.
Right, so when I do research for my stories, I look up what kind of cows would these be, and these would be the cows, right? And so I describe them so that people know that we're definitely in Africa. And so I keep that story very much in its culture because that's important. And then when you tell the story and you share the story, that's where the commonality is built, because it's like, well, we have cows, we have farmers that do this. And you might be telling in a community, it might be a farmer that you're telling the story to. And then all of a sudden it's this farmer's like, oh my gosh, I wonder if I'll get any star maidens coming down. Is it me? So I think being authentic as you can, like bringing your true self along with that story that you're sharing.
And do you adjust it all? I mean, you tell several stories typically, at least when I've seen you. Do you get a sense of what the audience is responding to and maybe not? And do you adjust on the spot?
Yeah, you can definitely feel it if they're not. I think anybody who performs on a stage will tell you that. Sometimes you're not sure if you're on, right? And you're doing the best job that you can be, but you sure as heck know if the audience isn't with you. Right? Yeah. And so you need to make an adjustment, and you can tell that when you're telling a story, and you can see where you start to lose them. And then you got to think, well, how can I draw them back? And so you use little things like, the tone of voice, the volume of your voice. You might get very, very quiet so that people are like, oh, hang on, what's he saying? I'm missing this now, right? And so they have to lean in to listen. Or you might just take a very long pause just to see what happens and then carry on with the story. For me, it's been an experience because, I tried all of these things. I watch a lot of comics as well.
Okay.
I watch a lot of comics because I love humor, and there's not enough humor in the world, I don't think. And everyone's like fighting each other, and it's like, I just want to bring a bit of joy, right? And so ever since I was a kid, I love comedy. And so, growing up, I watched a lot of English comics, Robin Williams being an American comic, and then watching him in interviews, finding comics that he loves and watching them to see why he liked them. There's comics that I haven't seen in years since I was a little kid. And something will pop up on YouTube and I'll be like, oh my gosh, that's where I get that from. And I have no idea that I pulled, it's had such an effect on me. It's just like sat inside all these years. And all of a sudden it's like coming out all of its own,
Do you have a particular story that you found had a great impact with an audience, perhaps even changed someone's perspective or even their life that you kind of like to tell?
Yeah, well, that first story that I told, I was in a school and it was a full school assembly. All the teachers are there and it's grades K through 8. And I told that story, and there was this one teacher who was like sitting pretty much in front of me. And you could tell that story like hit something inside her really deeply. So yeah, it does happen. It does happen. And sometimes people come up to you afterwards and they'll say, I needed to hear that story. And it's made me think of a situation that I'm in, think about it completely differently. And thank you very much. It doesn't happen all the time, but it happens enough to be noticeable. And it's not like a one-off or anything like that. And sometimes when you're telling a story in front of an audience, like when I'm telling more than one, sometimes a story will hide. It won't want to be told, even though it's like, I know that story really well. And it's like, why can't I think of it right now? It's like it's hiding. It's like, I'm gun shy. I'm not going to be told, right? But then there'll be another story going, me, tell me. And it's jumping up and down. And for me, it's like, all right, I have to tell this story. And so that's the story that I'll tell. And sometimes in those cases, that's when someone will come up to me afterwards and say, I really needed to hear that story.
Interesting.
And it's just, it's just like, wow, it's the story. It's not me. Right? Yeah. It must have known that you were in the audience because it was like, it was calling out to be told.
So there's a lot of art to this and a little bit of gut sense of
yeah.
kind of what's needed at the moment.
Right.
Interesting.
We live in this age of short attention spans and digital overload. Has storytelling changed in the modern era? How do you capture and keep an audience's attention today?
That's a really good question. So the best way of answering that is describing kids after 2020, when they hadn't been in school for a year. They hadn't had all school assemblies, and they hadn't been taught to sit still and sit down, whereas they had been given devices because parents were at home trying to get their work done. And they're like, here, go watch YouTube, right? And off they would go, right? And they watched Talking Heads all day or whatever. And so when I got back, when we got back to getting into schools, attention spans were shot to pieces. There was no attention span. So where I would tell 4 stories in an hour, I might only be able to tell 3, because there'd be a lot of interruptions. There would be, people fidgeting, getting up and down, going to the bathroom and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
I'm talking about school kids here. And so it's taken a while to get back to somewhat normal now. There are still some kids that are like that, but they fall into the stories. It might take 2 stories for them to fall into now instead of 1. But once you get them, I told to kindergarten the other day, and they said, well, we'll give you half an hour. And, if you can get 20 minutes out of them, that would be brilliant. I went for 40 minutes with them, and they were just mesmerized by it. And I think it's because I chose the right stories. The right stories came to me, and they were in the right space, and they just needed to hear the stories right there and then. And then afterwards they went nuts.
Oh, time to go.
Yeah, absolutely. Checkout time. Ah, where's the sugar?
So how does someone become a better storyteller? What are the essential skills to develop, and are there any common mistakes to avoid?
Yeah, so I would stay away from accents.
Like trying to introduce accents.
Yeah,
Okay.
so a lot of Americans, they love the Irish and Scottish accents.
Yeah.
And I've heard some storytellers try to do a Scottish or Irish accent, and it's horrible. There are some storytellers out there that are really good at it, but you have to be really good at an accent.
I got to confess something.
Okay.
So I try to use like an Irish Scottish accent.
Okay.
And my family tells me I sound like a fishmonger. It's horrendous. I've been cut off. So even within my safe family network here, I'm not allowed to try at my attempts at an accent from the UK.
Right. Well, so here's the thing. My parents were divorced, and I have a half brother and half sister who grew up in South Wales, in Swansea. In Wales, they teach you how to speak Welsh, right? And so they grew up in Wales. They spoke a little Welsh. And I started telling more Welsh tales, and I wanted to use accents when people are talking in my stories because I use a lot of dialogue. I would phone up my sister and say, this is my Welsh accent. Like, how does it go? And she's like, no, you sound like a Jamaican and a Pakistani had a baby. It's like, oh, okay, all right. So I go away and I'll watch and listen to a lot of Welsh stuff. And I try to find the shape in my mouth of how that sound comes out. And then I would phone up my sister again, like, any better? She's like, keep going, you're getting closer, right? And so this is basically what I've been, don't do accents unless you're going to work on them, right? And talk to someone that knows the accent. Otherwise, just don't do it. There's no need to do it because we don't do German accents when we're telling grim stories, right? We don't. There was Cinderella clean. We don't do that. We don't. And we don't do French accents when we're telling stories that were collected by Perrault, right? And so why do Irish and Scottish and Welsh or English stories with an accent, right? If you're good at accents and you can get away with it, you know them, then do them, but don't otherwise. I think to be able to tell the best story is what I do is I break a story down into 7 sections, right? Marble, when the company first came out, they did a big test just to see how many numbers can people remember. And, it's like that game that you play with kids. You put a whole bunch of stuff on a tray. Yeah. You let them look at it for a minute, you take it away, and then you come back and say, how many things can you remember in a minute, right? And it's on average 7. So if you break a story down into 7 sections and you remember those sections rather than the words of a story, right? Kind of like a storyboard, right? Like a storyboard for a movie or a comic strip or whatever, right? You remember 7 panels of that. You remember those 7 sections, and then you just tell those sections one after the other. And that way the story's fresh every time because you're imagining it fresh every time, hopefully. You're not getting bogged down in the words. It doesn't sound route, That's really important. And again, just going back to being authentic. Put yourself in the story. If you've heard another storyteller tell a story and you want to tell it exactly the same as that storyteller, I think that's okay to get used to that story. But what I would suggest is drop that as soon as you can and find your own authentic voice, right? Find out how you would tell a story, around the water cooler. Like, how do you tell stories to your colleagues at work? Yeah. Right. And use that same style because you do have a style. Everyone has their own style. Yeah. Use that style to tell the stories that you're telling.
And by style, you mean like our tone, our inflection, or even the rhythm of our speech?
Right. Yeah. Listen to yourself or listen to other people and see how they talk.
How long do you practice a story? One, put it out there and try to deliver it,
Mhm.
and two, before you really feel like you have it mastered.
It depends on the story. There's some stories that jump in your head and they just stick there. It's like a spider on a spider's web. It's just, it's there and it's not going to go anywhere, and you know it, right?
Yeah.
And then there are other stories that my personal style is I find lots of variants of different stories, and then I'll write it out in my own vernacular, in my own words, and not, so I don't have to think about other people's words and how they would describe things going on, and then break it down to the 7 scenes. So the practicing can take like 5 or 6 times of running through it before I feel that I can take it out and share it with someone. Ideally, I want to tell it 100 times before it's in my body.
Yeah.
So when you actually go out and tell a story, sometimes it's really there and you've got it and you don't have to worry about it. And there are other times where each time you tell it, there's a little pause here and there's a little pause there because you're thinking, how can I make this better? And you practice in front of a live audience, right? I mean, that's what you do. And your audience can tell you if it's working or not. And that's the way of working on a story.
Do you continue to tweak them? Even a story that you've told 100 or more times, do you continue to tweak and improve? Or
I wouldn't say I try to tweak or improve them, but sometimes something will come out in the telling that you weren't expecting. And it's like, where the heck did that come from? That's when at the end of the story, you reach for your phone or a pen and you write that down because you don't want to forget it, because it's like, that is key. That adds another dimension to the story that I've never thought about before.
Interesting.
And sometimes you might be talking to someone about a story that you just told, and then that thought of like that conversation is still in your subconscious. And then when you're telling the next story, something in your subconscious clicks with that previous story that comes out in that other story that you're telling. And so to say that I master a story, you never really master a story. There's always something that will happen, or you'll have a life event, right? Something might happen in your life. You'll be telling the story and you'll be like, oh my gosh, I know how I can tell this better now.
Right. Because
you're bringing yourself into that story. There's something that happened to you that may have happened to that character in the story. You can pull on your own experience. And that, it's not just stories. It's like if people are out selling stuff, right? And you've heard a folk tale, there's something in that folk tale that's like, oh my gosh, I can incorporate that into my sales pitch.
Right.
Right. Or if I'm talking to my team, then I can use something that I heard in that folk story, and even maybe mention that folk story, or even use that folk story if you can remember it well enough, right? And throw it in there.
Yeah.
And you can use that story to make a point, and people will remember that story and therefore remember that point, because people remember stories better than they, bullet points.
Yeah, you're really hitting on where we're going to go next, which was, storytelling isn't just for entertainment. And we're talking here to folks who are engaged every day in negotiations and trying to influence. And as Simon is saying, stories illustrate sometimes the concepts or the points we're trying to make. It certainly plays a huge role in business and, leadership. We talked military and education.
Right.
I can't imagine trying to go through educational experience at grade school or high school level or even college without stories being told. How do you see it? And just to kind of continue on this kind of path we've been on, but how stories help in those different sectors and spaces kind of convey ideas?
Well, I think with leadership, a lot of these folk tales, like I said, there's a helper somewhere along the line, right?
Yeah.
Or there's something that happens in the story that you can draw on as inspiration. Like going back to that first story that I told. If you're a leader, maybe you haven't had those thoughts about, I need to know my staff better, right? And so you start to look at your staff better. Well, what skills do they have? Oh my gosh, I didn't realize they could do that. Maybe they need to be in this position instead, right? And then you're utilizing what they're best at. And, these folk and fairy tales can show you that, right? That particular story is a really good example of that. There are other things as well. I mean, the way that people go through their lives isn't necessarily like a story, but these stories reflect how we go through life.
Yeah.
If you get that, right? And so you have these helpers in the stories. And so do you want to be a helper, or do you want to be the giant that's going to slit the throats of the kids in the bed, right, who are sleeping, right? How are you going to get the best out of your business is by treating your staff the best way that you can. And when you listen to folk and fairy tales, you can hear that. I mean, reading I'm trying to think what it is now. Not the Tao Te Ching, right? There's a lot of leadership skills in that. I mean, they've written versions of it, the Tao for leaders and stuff. But I think reading the original version is probably better because it teaches you how to lead in front rather than just standing at the back and saying, well, let's see what happened. That didn't work out too well, did it? Let's try something else. Whereas like if you're going in with it and something goes wrong, you're there and you can help make adjustments on the fly if you're good at what you do, right? And then you can correct things with everybody else. That makes you a stronger leader and that makes everybody else respect you more. And a lot of these folk tales talk about these kinds of things. Jack goes out into the woods. He has no idea what he's doing. And he's go kill a giant. It's like, all right, how am I going to get rid of this one? All right. And so, I got a sack. I'll out-eat him. I'll just throw this porridge into my sack and the giant's like, you can, for a little fella, you can eat a lot. He says, another trick as well. Look, watch. I can get rid of it all. And he sticks a knife in opens up the thing and he starts to eat more and all the porridge comes out, right? And the giant's like, I love this porridge too. Can I try that? And Jack says, sure, go for it. Hands him the knife and the giant cuts his own stomach open and disembowels himself, right? So, it's like, what kind of lead did you...
That's not the version I remember hearing.
Right.
A lot of these stories have very gruesome sort of roots that we've Disneyified them, if we can use that term. I'm not sure. Now, all of a sudden, we're opening ourselves up for litigation.
Sanitize them.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, we've sanitized a lot of these stories. I was working at a school last week and we were teaching the kids fractured fairy tales, which are basically fairy tales. So take, for example, the Three Billy Goats Gruff. Turn the Three Billy Goats Gruff into Three Princess Ninjas. That's a fractured fairy tale. You've changed some of the characters and the troll becomes like a jack-o'-lantern or it becomes a monkey, right? And then what happens then, right? You fracture the fairy tale. These are really popular books, but they dilute the original message of the story, right? And so these are great examples of fun stories to entertain kids with, but do they actually teach the kids anything? And a lot of these stories teach us things, not just kids, right? Adults.
Yeah.
So they're important. I feel that folk and fairy tales have been dropped and the personal narrative story like the moth and all that kind of stuff, which is awesome because you get to empathize with other people that have had similar situations that you've had yourself, right? Or someone brings up a situation that you've never had, never want to have, but it's like, okay, I'm going to keep that in my head because I never want that to happen to me, right? But folk and fairy tales do that, right? And they're one step removed. They're not involving someone, so they're not triggering. Right? You can actually see what's going on in the story and be like, oh, that's what happened here. And then you put everything together and it's like, all right, I'm going to do this now instead. Without being triggered by what happened. Going back to your, you talk a lot about the army because both of you are from the army and the special forces and stuff. I think about stories like Beowulf, right? Beowulf was the ultimate warrior, right? He kills Grendel's mother and then he's in retirement and then some idiot steals some stuff from a dragon's hoard and now he has to go and kill the dragon and he's looked after all of these people all of his life. And when he goes to fight the dragon, he's like, who's going to come and help me? And there's one person out of everybody that comes to help him, right? And it's this minor character and he steps up and helps him. And it's like, wow, that's a powerful story. And if you don't know the story of Beowulf, look it up on Wikipedia. I'll have a synopsis there because it's an incredible story. And then the story, another epic like Gilgamesh, which is from Samaria, right? It's set between the Euphrates and the Tigris. And Gilgamesh is this tyrant king. So the people say, send us somebody to counteract this tyrant king. He's destroying everybody's lives. So they send down this man beast called Enkidu. And Enkidu is tamed by this priestess so that he can then tame Gilgamesh. And they go out on adventures and they do things against the gods, but with some of the gods' help. And the result of that is the gods kill off Enkidu. And then Gilgamesh is his battle brother, right? And he's like, I can't live without my battle brother. He was made by the gods and he died. Now he feels mortal, which he never did before. And so he goes out seeking immortality. And then he doesn't get it. And there's the story of the ark and the flood and all that kind of stuff is in there. And then he comes back with nothing except humility. And that is huge, to be this arrogant man at the beginning of the story and then to come back humble at the end and understand, I was a bit of a dick. Right? I need to level up now, right? There's so many great stories out there on all different, I have told Gilgamesh to sixth graders, but it's toned down.
Sure, right.
Because when Enkidu, the wild man, is tamed, the priestess sleeps with him for 7 days and 7 nights. And I tell the kids that he dances with her for 7 days and 7 nights. So there's a little bit of euphemism there. And when they get to college and they study it, if they study it, they're like, oh, that's what he was talking about. Right.
The power of being the storyteller, you can shape things. I was, as you were talking too, and I need to pass this back to Nolan here in a moment, but I was thinking, this saying about, does art imitate life or does life imitate art? I don't know maybe that's a silly question to ask when it comes to storytelling because they're really complementing each other. I
think yes. I think art imitates life, and I think life can imitate art as well. I think art reflects a lot more, but I think they walk hand in hand, like you said. Absolutely, yeah.
So I'm terrible at storytelling. So what advice would you give someone like me who's just believes that we're terrible at storytelling and just therefore avoids everything when it comes to storytelling.
Okay. Are you any good at plumbing?
No,
Why is that?
because I'm not a plumber.
Right. To be good at plumbing, you have to try it, right? And you have to do it on a regular basis,
Yeah.
right? You can change the washers in a tap, right? Because you've done it a few times, right? So it's the same with storytelling. If you practice it and you do it more and more often, you'll, just like anything else, you'll get better, right?
So is it just finding that story that
Yes.
has that message that you're trying to convey, I guess?
Yes, and it's finding that story that has that message that you want to convey, but that story has to resonate within you, right? So when you're reading a bunch of stories, you'll be like, that would be good for the message that I want, right? But then you keep reading, put a little Post-it note in there or something, right? And you'll keep reading and you'll be like, oh my gosh, this is an awesome story. And then you got to look at yourself and be like, why is this an awesome story? What does this story have that is making me resonate with it, right? Because that story will come across way better than the story that you're like, oh, that would be good for that, because you're not in that story. Whereas there's something in you in that other story that resonated, that jumped out at you.
I can resonate with that. So like, I'm not a big book reader. I never have been, but there are books that I've read that I just couldn't put down. And it's like, that's never happened to me whenever I read a book or read a story. And so that can definitely resonate.
Yeah. I mean, I have 250 books on a bookshelf behind me, which are all folk and fairy tales, myths and legends. And a lot of them have Post-it notes in them when I've read them. And I put the Post-it notes in there because it's like, that's a good story. I like that story. And I'll come back to it. And, you know, like we talked about at the top of the show, it's like, what's your favorite story? Well, it depends on what mood I'm in, right? And if I go back to a story and I reread it, it'll be like, oh my gosh, that's a terrible story. Why on earth did I bookmark this one, right? And then I'll go read, you know, I might read the next story just because I was so disappointed in bookmarking that one. And I'll be like, oh, this one's all right. I like this. So I'll move that Post-it note and then I'll go back again. And if that story resonates with me 2 or 3 times, then it's like, that's a good story to tell, because I still like it after reading it 2 or 3 times. Because if I can read it 2 or 3 times and I can tell it, and people can listen to it 2 or 3 times, hopefully, right? And it has some point to it that I can share.
On stories, I want to ask, if you had just one story, it was the last story you could tell in your lifetime, what story would it be and why are you choosing this one?
Well, if it's the last story to choose in my life, if I'm on my deathbed.
That's right.
But
you don't have to keep it short. You're not like going to die instantaneously. You can,
right.
So you have, you know you're going to get the whole story out. What's it going to be?
Well, I don't know, because it would totally depend on what my mind space was on my deathbed.
This is the story we're going to remember you by.
Well, so now I'm not looking at my favorite story. I'm looking at your favorite story, right?
We're audience focused. Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
And so I mean, it really does. It's what's your favorite wine? Or should I say, what would you like to drink on a Friday night? Yeah. Right? It depends on what you've been doing. It depends on the mood that you're in and who you're hanging out with, right?
Yeah.
If you're hanging out with your football guys, you're probably not going to say, I'll have a nice Cabernet. I'll take a glass of Cabernet, please. They're all going to be like, what the heck are you drinking? What's Cabernet, right? And likewise, if you're meeting with some, you know, high-flying clients and you say, I'll have a bud, you know, they're going to be like, oh, dear Lord, what are we doing business with this fella for? Right? You know, it depends on the mood and who you're with. And
all right. What's your final story going to be?
One of my favorite stories, and I have a whole bunch of different favorite stories, but this one, like, it's always like there in the top 5, 10. It's a story from India, and it's a story about this young couple who have recently got married, and in that culture they moved to the wife's town, and this couple have never argued and they've never fought. They've never said a mean word to one another, which is why we know it's a fairy tale, right? And everything's going really, really. They live in a nice little house and everything. And she's a seamstress and he works away from home. And it's the monsoon season. And husband goes to work. He's got his coat on. Off he goes. And she's working. And the storms start to come in. The clouds come over. The sky gets really, really dark. The rains come down. She gets this lantern out and she takes a match and lights the lantern. And the light fills the whole space that she's working in. And that flame, when it comes to life, it watches her as she finishes her sewing. And that flame watches her as she folds up that robe that she'd been mending. And the flame watches as she wraps it up in paper and ties it with string. And that flame watches as she goes and makes a cup of tea, and watches as she makes her supper. And the flame watches as she sits that cup of tea down, sits down in a chair and falls asleep. Inside this woman is a story that she knows, and there's a song that she knows. And the song is sitting there thinking, she never sings me. I'm fed up of not being sung. If she's not going to sing me, I'm going to find somewhere else to go where I can be sung, where I can do what I'm supposed to do. And that song climbs up out of her stomach, out through her heart, out through her throat. It jumps out of her mouth and it turns itself into a coat and hangs itself on the door. Well, the story's looking around and says, well, she knows me as well, but she never tells me. She never tells me. I'm a story. I want to be told. I want to be told. I want someone to hear me. And so the story does the same thing. It climbs out of her stomach, out through her heart, out through her mouth, and it turns itself into a pair of boots on the ground. Because stories are like boots and they love to travel. And songs are like coats. They like to wrap us up and keep us comfortable and warm. Well, the husband gets home. He opens the door. Wife wakes up. She turns around and says, oh, how are you? How you doing? It's good to see you. Did you have a good day? And he says, yeah, it was a good day. How about you? She says, yeah, everything was great. I got the robes finished for the priest and all the rest of it. Then he takes his coat off and shuts the door, and he's about to hang his coat up, and he sees the other coat hanging there. Whose coat's this? And she says, I don't know. You've been here all day? Yeah. And you've had no guests? Yeah. Well, whose coat is it then? And whose boots are these? What boots? And she stands up and she looks and she sees the boots. I don't know, she says. I don't know. But you've been here all day and you haven't left. Yet there's a coat on the back of the door that's not mine, and there's a pair of boots there that are not mine. What do you mean? What's going on? And for the first time ever, they start to fight and they argue, and the flame watches all of this. And eventually the woman turns around to her husband and she says, well, if you don't believe me, then leave. Tears are falling down her face. And so he quietly opens the door, closes it behind him, and walks off into the night. Now, by then it's late at night. This is the village of his wife's family, and he doesn't know really where he can spend the rest of the night, but he doesn't want to spend it with her family. And so he goes to the monkey temple, the temple of Hanuman, and he settles there for the night. And he finds this corner far away from everything, far away from everyone. Not that there's anybody there. And he tries to make himself as comfortable as possible. And then he hears voices. Nobody wants to be in a dark temple in the middle of the night, not knowing who those voices are. And so very quietly, he gets closer and closer to the voices, and they sound like whispers. And as he gets closer, he sees this light in one part of the temple. And when he gets there, he sees the spirits of all the flames, and they're all gossiping. You see, when the flames are extinguished overnight, the spirit of the flames goes to Hanuman's temple. That's where they reside. And he listened to these flames as they gossiped. And then this one flame came in a little bit later than all the others. And, oh, where have you been? Where have you been? Say the flames. Oh, you wouldn't believe what happened at my house. Oh, tell us. What's going on? Well, the husband got back and he saw a coat on the back of the door that wasn't his, and there was a pair of boots on the foot of the door that weren't his. And they got into an argument. Oh, of course they got into an argument. Oh, that brazen hussy. What was she doing? No, says the flame. That's not what happened. What do you mean? What really happened there? Well, that wife, she knew a song and she knew a story. And she never told them. She never sang them. And so the song left her and it turned into the coat when she was sleeping after drinking a tea, and it landed on the back of the door. And the story didn't want to be on its own, so it too left and turned itself into boots, because stories are like boots. They like to travel, and coats are like songs. They like to keep us warm. And when the man heard this, he realized his mistake. He realized that he shouldn't have shouted at his wife. Now, obviously, it was too late to go back home, but the next morning he got up cold and weary and stiff, made his way back home to his house, and his wife was starting to make herself some tea and make herself some breakfast. And he walked in and he fell to his knees and apologized to her. And he told her everything that happened. The flames, the lantern. You knew a song, you knew a story. Sing me the song. And she thought, but the song wouldn't come to her. Well, tell me the story, he said. And she thought, but the story wouldn't come to her either, for she had thrown the coat and the boots out. So if you know a song, sing it. And if you know a story, tell it. Because a song will keep us warm on those cold nights. And stories are like boots. They love to travel.
Yeah, that was good. Nice. Man, we could do this all day. I appreciate that.
We sure could.
Yes, I could too.
Well, Simon, we're at the end of our podcast. What is just a final thought that you'd love to leave with our listeners?
I think just that story. If you know a song, sing it. If you know a story, tell it. Because stories are like boots and they love to travel.
Appreciate that. On that note, I just want to say thanks. Really appreciate you coming up from New London.
I appreciate you asking me onto this show. It was a huge surprise. I knew of your show. I'd listened to a few episodes. And when you shot me the email, I was like, oh my gosh, yeah, I'd love to.
Oh, thanks.
But why me?
Because we want our listeners to be better storytellers.
And listeners as well.
Yeah. Nolan, over to you.
Well, that is it for us on today's podcast. Please rate, review, and subscribe to the NEGOTIATEx podcast if you haven't already. And we'll see you in the next episode.